Hi, I'm Charlotte Hu, and I'm working on something of a conspiracy theory, but I'm not normally the kind of person who puts a tin hat on. What I'm interested in is whether or not Mao Zedong may have engineered the Korean conflict. So let me open this up a little bit more and explain why I care. I care because I've seen a couple of books recently. First of all, The Economist that went this week with our president to China. Actually, he went to Argentina, but they met with the leader of China to discuss our trade relations. And Peter Navarro has written a whole series of books on the economic relations between the U.S. and China going back to 2006. He's been quite a prolific author. But what I found most interesting is specifically the book he wrote called Crouching Tiger, that talks about whether or not the United States and China are destined for war. And that brings up the title of another book by Graham Allison, whether or not the United States and China can escape the Thucides trap. So both authors, and I consider Peter Navarro the more convincing of the two, talk about whether or not China as a rising power is inevitably destined for physical conflict with the United States. So there's a couple of theories, a couple of problems I have with the theory that China is a rising power. First, in On China, Kissinger doesn't call China a rising power. He calls it a resurgent power, which I think is a more accurate description. China, unlike the other states that were discussed in Thucydides' trap, is not a state that has never had power. In fact, as Kissinger describes in his book on China, China is really the quintessential world power, going back to the days of Jesus. China has always ruled the world, and in the eyes of many Chinese, it has a destined right to own a place at the top of the world power. So this makes it very different from the previous cases of the Thucydides trap, where we're discussing a rising power in conflict with an existing power. China is not a rising power, and that's very important to think about, because it sees itself as always having been a predominant force in the global economy, and therefore it's not really at conflict with the United States. It is, and it isn't. But the way I see it, China has been at conflict with the United States since the United States gained power, which is World War II. At the end of World War II, the two dominant forces, we all know this history, were the United States and Moscow. Those two people, those two forces, those two states, those two nations that came out of the World War with the greatest economic power, technical power, domestic confidence, and global confidence, therefore positioned both of those countries to be the automatic opponents of China. And what Kissinger talks about, more importantly, in his book on China, is that the Chinese methodology for waging war is very different from a standard, let's say, Clausian perspective of direct conflict. The Chinese have always viewed conflict as inauspicious, to quote Swensa in The Art of War. War is something to be avoided because it drains the coffers of your nation, because it reduces your social and global political clout. So direct conflict is not something that effective leaders will engage in. What's important is to reduce the power of your enemies. So Kissinger gives us a couple of clues in On China. First, he says that the Chinese were already heading south on the peninsula when they deceived Moscow with a cable. Mao Zedong sent a cable to Moscow saying China would not interfere in the events of the South Korean, North Korean peninsula. This was a straight-out lie. It was pure deception, and it was intended to bring Moscow into the conflict on the Korean peninsula. What we don't know, and what Kissinger is uncertain about, is whose idea was it to create the conflict on the peninsula? Moscow blamed Beijing, Beijing blamed Moscow. No one seems to think that the idea originated in North Korea. So what we don't know is whether or not Mao created the idea. My suspicion is he did. So if Mao put the idea in the North Koreans' minds to invade South Korea, to invade Seoul specifically, and then, knowing that the Americans and other allied forces would come in on the side of the South Koreans, on the democratic side, knowing he could goad the other Communist Party power in the world into coming in on the side of the North Koreans, he may have engineered the death of 3 million people. Now, it's difficult for us with a Judeo-Christian ethic to consider this, because we wouldn't consider that a simple, calculated chess move. But let's be clear that human life does not have the same value in classic Chinese strategic text that the Judeo-Christian ethic gives to the human life. So the untimely loss of 3 million people might not have been important in Mao's thinking. If it's true that my theory is accurate and that Mao Zedong engineered the Korean conflict and created the death of 3 million, the untimely loss of 3 million people, civilian and military, he effected the greatest military champion, effected the greatest military achievement that I have ever studied. Because what he did, according to Kissinger, is at the end of that conflict, the winner was China. The economic coffers of both Russia and the United States were depleted. We depleted our military forces and our human lives. We depleted our domestic political clout and global clout. But the winner of the Korean conflict, if you can even imagine that there was one from such horrific bloodshed, was the country of China. Because by decreasing the clout, political importance, the global respect for its 2 primary enemies, China was able to move its way a little further up toward where it sees its natural place to be, at the top of the global power. It has continued since the 1950s to work on its economic power, which it sees as the most important element of global power. So what we're seeing today is that the Thucydides trap in this question as to whether or not the US and China might come into physical conflict is really kind of absurd. We have been in physical conflict since before my mom was born.